Nevertheless, it was necessary at all cost to attach to himself these Indians, who from their situation were able to hinder all communication between La Salle and Canada. In order to strike their imagination, Cavalier de La Salle proceeds to their encampment, where more than 3,000 men are assembled. He has but 20 men, but he traverses their village haughtily and stops at some distance. The Illinois, who have not yet declared war, are surprised. They advance towards him and overwhelm him with pacific demonstrations. So versatile is the spirit of the savages, such an impression does every mark of courage make upon them. Without delay, La Salle takes advantage of their friendly dispositions and erects upon the very site of their camp a small fort, which he calls Crevecoeur, in allusion to the troubles which he has already experienced. There he leaves Tonty with all his people, and he himself, anxious about the fate of the Griffin, returns with 3 Frenchmen and 1 Indian to the fort of Cataraqui, separated by 500 leagues from Crevecoeur. Before setting out, he had detached with Father Hennepin, one of his companions named Dakin, on a mission to reascend the Mississippi beyond the river of the Illinois, and if possible, to its source. These 2 travelers, says Father Charlevoix, set out from the fort of Crevecoeur on February 28th, and having entered the Mississippi, ascended it as far as 46 degrees of north latitude. There they were stopped by a considerable waterfall, extending quite across the river, to which Father Hennepin gave the name of St. Anthony of Padua. Then they fell, I know not by what mischance, into the hands of the Sioux, who kept them for a long time prisoners. On his journey back to Cataraqui, La Salle, having discovered a new site appropriate to the construction of a fort, summoned Tonty thither, who immediately set to work, while La Salle continued his route. This is Fort St. Louis. On his arrival at Cataraqui, La Salle learned news which would have broken down a man of a less hardy temperament. Not only had the Griffin, on board of which he had furs of the value of 10,000 crowns, been lost, but a vessel which was bringing him from France a cargo worth 880 L. had been shipwrecked, and his enemies had spread a report of his death. Having no further business at Cataraqui, and having proved by his presence that the reports of his disappearance were all false, he arrived again at the fort of Crevecoeur, where he was much astonished to find no one. This is what had happened. While the Chevalier Tonty was employed in the construction of Fort St. Louis, the garrison of Fort Crevecoeur had mutinied, had pillaged the magazines, had done the same at Fort Miami, and then fled to Machilimackinac. Tonty, almost alone in face of the Illinois, who were roused against him by the depredations of his men, and judging that he could not resist in his fort of Crevecoeur, had left it on September 11th, 1680, with the 5 Frenchmen who composed his garrison, and had retired as far as the bay of the lake. Michigan, after having placed a garrison at Crevecoeur and at Fort St. Louis, La Salle came to Machilimackinac, where he rejoined Tonty, and together they set out again from thence towards the end of August for Cataraqui, whence they embarked on the Lake Erie with 55 persons, on August 28, 1681. After a journey of 240 miles along the frozen river of the Illinois, they reached Fort Crevecoeur, where the water, free from ice, permitted the use of their canoes. On February 6, 1682, La Salle arrived at the confluence of the Illinois and the Mississippi. He descended the river, sighted the mouth of the Missouri and that of the Ohio, where he raised a fort, penetrated into the country of the Arkansas, of which he took possession in the name of France, crossed the country of the Natchez, with whom he made a treaty of friendship, and finally passed out into the Gulf of Mexico on Apeth, after a navigation of 1050 miles in a mere bark. The anticipations so skillfully conceived by Cavalier de La Salle were realized. He immediately took formal possession of the country, to which he gave the name of Louisiana, and called the immense river which he had just discovered the St. Louis. La Salle's return to Canada occupied not less than 1 year and a half. There is no ground for astonishment when all the obstacles scattered in his path are considered. What energy, what strength of mind were requisite in one of the greatest travelers of whom France has reason to be proud, to succeed in such an enterprise. Unhappily, a man, otherwise well-intentioned, but who allowed himself to be prejudiced against La Salle by his numerous enemies, M. Lefebvre de la Barre, who had succeeded M. de Frontenac as governor of Canada, wrote to the Minister of Marine that the discoveries of La Salle were not to be regarded as of much importance. This traveler, he said, was actually, with about 20 French vagabonds and savages, at the extremity of the bay, where he played the part of sovereign, plundered and ransomed those of his own nation, exposed the people to the incursions of the Iroquois, and covered all these acts of violence with the pretext of the permission, which he had from his majesty, to carry on commerce alone in the countries which he might be able to discover. Cavalier de la Salle could not allow himself to remain exposed to these calumnious imputations. On the one side, honor prompted him to return to France to exculpate himself. On the other, he would not leave others to reap the profit of his discoveries. He set out, therefore, and received from Seignelay a kindly welcome. The minister had not been much influenced by the letters of M. de la Barre. He was aware that men could not accomplish great achievements without wounding much self-love, nor without making numerous enemies. La Salle took the opportunity to explain to him his project of discovering the mouth of the Mississippi by sea in order to open a way for French vessels and to found an establishment there. The minister entered into these views and gave him a commission which placed Frenchmen and savages under his orders, from Fort St. Louis to the sea. At the same time, the commandant of the squadron which was to transport him to America was to be under his authority, and to furnish him on his disembarkation with all the succors which he might require, provided that nothing was done to the prejudice of the king. 4 vessels, one of them a frigate of 40 guns, commanded by M. de Beaujeu, were to carry 280 persons, including the crews, to the mouth of the Mississippi to form the nucleus of the new colony. Soldiers and artisans had been very badly chosen, as was perceived when too late, and no one knew his business. Setting sail from La Rochelle on July 24, 1684, the little squadron was almost immediately obliged to return to port, the bowsprit of the frigate having broken suddenly in the very finest weather. This inexplicable accident was the commencement of misunderstanding between M. de Beaujeu and M. de la Salle. The former could scarcely be pleased to see himself subordinated to a private individual, and did not forgive Cavalier this. Nothing, however, would have been more easy than to decline the command. La Salle had not the gentleness of manner and the politeness necessary to conciliate his companions. The disagreement did but gather force during the voyage, by reason of the obstacles raised by M. de Beaujeu to the rapidity and secrecy of the expedition. The annoyances of La Salle had indeed become so great when he arrived at St. Domingo that he fell seriously ill. He recovered, however, and the expedition set sail again on November 25th. A month later, it was off Florida, but as La Salle had been assured that in the Gulf of Mexico all the currents bore eastwards, he did not doubt that the mouth of the Mississippi must be far to the west, an error which was the source of all his misfortunes. La Salle then steered to the west, and passed by without perceiving it, without deigning even to attend to certain signs which he was asked to observe, the mouth of the Mississippi. When he perceived his mistake, and entreated M. de Beaujeu to turn back, the latter would no longer consent. La Salle, seeing that he could make no impression upon the contradictory mind of his companion, decided to disembark his men and his provisions in the Bay of St. Bernard. Yet in this very last act, Beaujeu manifested an amount of culpable ill will, which did as little honor to his judgment as to his patriotism. Not only was he unwilling to land all the provisions, under the pretext that certain of them being at the bottom of the hold, he had no time to change his stowage, but further, he gave shelter on board his own ship to the master and crew of the transport, laden with the stores, utensils, and implements necessary for a new establishment, people whom everything seems to convict of having purposely cast their vessel upon shore. At the same time, a number of savages took advantage of the disorder caused by the shipwreck of the transport to plunder everything on which they could lay their hands. Nevertheless, La Salle, who had the talent of never appearing depressed by misfortune, and who found in his own genius resources adapted to the circumstances of the case, ordered the works of the establishment to be begun. In order to give courage to his companions, he more than once took part with his own hands in the work, but very slow progress was made, in consequence of the ignorance of the workmen. Struck with the resemblance of the language and habits of the Indians of these parts to those of the Mississippi, La Salle was very soon persuaded that he was not far distant from that river, and made several excursions in order to approach it. But if he found a country beautiful and fertile, he did not make progress towards what he was in search of. He returned each time to the fort more gloomy and more harsh, and this was not the way to restore calm to spirits embittered by sufferings and the inutility of their efforts. Grain had been sown, but scarcely any came up for want of rain, and what had sprung up was soon laid waste by the savages and the deer. The hunters who wandered far from the camp were massacred by the Indians, and sickness found an easy prey in men overwhelmed with ennui, disappointment, and misery. In a short time, the number of the colonists fell to 37. At length, La Salle resolved to try a last effort to reach the Mississippi, and in descending the river to seek help from the nations with which he had made alliance. He set out on January 12, 1687, with his brother, his 2 nephews, 2 missionaries, and 12 colonists. He was approaching the country of the Shawnees, when, in consequence of an altercation between one of his nephews and 3 of his companions, these latter assassinated the young man and his servant during their sleep, and resolved immediately to do the same with the chief of the enterprise. De La Salle, uneasy at not seeing his nephew return, set out to seek him on the morning of the 19th, with Father Anastase. The assassins, seeing him approach, lay in ambush in a thicket, and one of them shot him in the head and stretched him on the ground stark dead. Thus perished Cavalier de La Salle, a man of a capacity, says Father Charlevoix, of a largeness of mind, of a courage and firmness of soul, which might have led him to the achievement of something great, if with so many great qualities he had known how to master his gloomy and atrabilious disposition, and to soften the severity, or rather the harshness of his nature. Many calumnies had been spread abroad against him, but it is necessary so much the more to be on our guard against all these malevolent reports, as it is only too common to exaggerate the defects of the unfortunate, to impute to them even some which they had not, especially when they have given occasion for their misfortune, and have not known how to make themselves beloved. What is sadder for the memory of this celebrated man is that he has been regretted by few persons, and that the ill success of his undertakings, only of his last, has given him the air of an adventurer among those who judge only by appearances. Unhappily, these are usually the most numerous, and in some degree the voice of the public. Assassination of La Salle. Assassination of La Salle. We have but little to add to these last wise words. La Salle knew not how to obtain pardon for his first success. We have related subsequently by what concurrence of circumstances his second enterprise miscarried. He died, the victim, it may be said, of the jealousy and malevolence of the Chevalier de Beaujeu. It is to this slight cause that we owe the failure to found in America a powerful colony, which would very soon have been found in a condition to compete with the English establishments. We have narrated the beginning of the English colonies. The events which took place in England were highly favorable to them. The religious persecutions, the revolutions of 1648 furnished numerous recruits who, animated by an excellent spirit, set themselves to work and transported to the other side of the Atlantic the arts, the industry, and in a short time the prosperity of the mother country. Very soon, the immense forests which covered Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Carolina fell beneath the hatchet of the squatter, and the soil became cleared, while the hunters of the woods, driving back the Indians, made the interior of the country better known and prepared the work of civilization. In Mexico, in the whole of Central America, in Peru, in Chile, and on the shores of the Atlantic, a different state of things prevailed. The Spaniards had extended their conquests, but far from acting like the English, they had reduced the Indians to slavery. Instead of applying themselves to the cultivation appropriate to the variety of the climates and of the countries of which they had made themselves masters, they sought only in the produce of the mines the resources and prosperity which they should have endeavored to obtain from the land. If a country can thus rapidly attain prodigious wealth, yet this factitious system cannot last long. With the mines a prosperity which does not renew itself must ere long become exhausted. The Spaniards could not fail to experience the sad result. Thus then, at the end of the 17th century, a great part of the New World was known. In North America, Canada, the shores of the Atlantic and of the Gulf of Mexico, the valley of the Mississippi, the coasts of California and of New Mexico, were discovered or colonized. All the central part of the continent, from Rio del Norte as far as terra firma, was subject, at least nominally, to the Spaniards. In the south, the savannas and the forests of Brazil, the pampas of the Argentine, and the interior of Patagonia escaped the observation of the explorers, as they were destined to do for a long time yet. In Africa, the long line of coasts, which are washed by the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, had been patiently followed and observed by navigators. At some points only, colonists and missionaries had tried to penetrate the mystery of this vast continent. Senegal, Congo, the Valley of the Nile, and Abyssinia were all that were known with some degree of detail and of certainty. If many of the countries of Asia, surveyed by the travelers of the Middle Ages, had not been revisited since that epoch, we had carefully explored the whole anterior part of that continent. India had been revealed to us. We had even founded some establishments there. China had been touched by our missionaries, and Japan, that famous Cipango which had exercised so great an attraction for our travelers of the preceding age, was at length known to us. Only Siberia and the whole northeast angle of Asia had escaped our investigations, and it was not yet known whether America was not connected with Asia, a mystery which was before long to be cleared up. In Oceania, a number of archipelagos of islands and separate islets remained still to be discovered, but the islands of Sunda were colonized, the coasts of Australia and of New Zealand had been partially revealed, and the existence of that great continent which, according to Tasman, extended from Tierra del Fuego to New Zealand, began to be doubted. But it still required the long and careful researches of Cook to banish definitely into the domain of fable a chimera so long cherished. Geography was on the point of transforming itself. The great discoveries made in astronomy were about to be applied to geography. The labors of Fernel, and above all of Picard, upon the measure of a terrestrial degree between Paris and Amiens, had made it clear that the globe is not a sphere, but a spheroid, that is to say, a ball flattened at the poles and swollen at the equator, and thus were found at one stroke the form and the dimensions of the world which we inhabit. At length, the labors of Picard, continued by La Hire and Cassini, were completed at the commencement of the following century. The astronomical observations, rendered possible by the calculation of the satellites of Jupiter, enabled us to rectify our maps. If this rectification had been already effected with regard to certain places, it became indispensable when the number of points of which the astronomical position had been observed had been considerably increased, and this was to be the work of the next century. At the same time, historical geography was more studied. It began to take for its foundation the study of inscriptions, and archaeology was about to become one of the most useful instruments of comparative geography. In a word, the 17th century is an epoch of transition and of progress. It seeks, and it finds the powerful means which its successor, the 18th century, was destined to put into operation. The era of the sciences has already opened, and with it, the modern world commences. End of the second part.